So one definition of mindfulness is the awareness that arises from paying attention in certain kinds of ways, in a directed way, in an embodied way, which means we, as we did in that opening practice, is dropping it into the experience of our bodies, which are always in the here and now. The third aspect of how we can pay attention mindfully is related to attitude. It's related to the way in which we, or perhaps the how of our attention rather than the what or the where. And there are a number of different ways of describing this. John Kabat-Zinn describes it as non-judgmentally. I've also heard it described as with an attitude of warm-heartedness or kindness. And so compassion or friendliness, which is another word that sometimes is used, is integral to the how of paying attention. It's a bit like, to use Willem Kuyken's analogy, it's a bit like having a lens over a camera, kind of a filter over a camera, where just like a filter can offer a certain kind of color or a certain sort of flavor. So the flavor of our attention in mindfulness training is friendly, is intrinsically friendly, and therefore compassionate, connecting, because compassion really means to connect with the experience of potentially ourselves, if it's self-compassion, or of another or others, if it's kind of a wider sense of compassion. So this is important because we can return from, for example, mind wandering in a mindfulness practice in an aggressive way, in a self-critical way, in a hard, kind of unforgiving way. And that's not mindfulness. It might be attention, but it's not mindfulness. Whereas it's possible also to return from the wandering of the mind with an attitude of friendliness, of acceptance, of gentleness, and actually returning as an act of kindness, and to bring this to every obstacle perhaps we experience in our meditation practice and in our lives. So it's really integral, although you could say implicit in the practice. So every time that we are forgiving with ourselves and our minds, every time that we are not trying to fix or strive for a particular result, or struggle to change something that can't be changed, implicitly we are being kind to the experience. And this seems to be supportive for well-being. So mindfulness implicitly connects us to qualities of kindness. And then there is also this sort of implicit stroke explicit invitation to put a lens, or kind of hold a lens of kindness to everything that we experience, we see, we hear, we feel, etc. And we can do this because it's actually a part of our human heritage. So from a biological point of view, we are a species that has survived by existing together with others of our species. Humans haven't tended to survive well on their own, which is why most people, on the whole, want and need some form of human connection in order to be well. And it's adaptive from an evolutionary point of view in lots of ways. Child rearing, for example, we're not one of those species that kind of produces offspring ready-made for the world. We've got large brains that need to develop, and so for the human baby is pretty much helpless for a significant period of time. And so this kind of tending to the young is one expression of kindness. and that being adaptive for our survival. It's also quite effective for if we are attacked as a group, to be in a group, because we're not actually particularly strong creatures physically compared to some others. So this togetherness is supportive from a very basic point of view. We also have access, like other mammals, to a soothing system within us. So we have our sympathetic nervous system, which gets activated when we are stressed or we're facing a possible threat, or indeed an imagined threat, because of course as humans we can imagine threats which can set off that sympathetic nervous system. And we have a parasympathetic nervous system in common with other animals, where when we are not under threat, when things are okay and safe, our body drops into kind of a restful state, and we can feel kind of soothed and safe and well. And this too is a kind of an expression of kindness that we can perhaps tap into. So we have the capacity for friendliness and kindness and soothing already within us. It's a matter in mindfulness training of bringing this out, or maybe bringing it in as well. So actually connecting with these capacities that we have. And so when we train in kindness, we're not trying to get something external to ourselves, but rather inclining our attention to a climate of mind that we are already potentially connected to, which can be expressed through us. It's just that it isn't always expressed through us, because when we're faced by something that seems threatening, we naturally default to aversion and struggle or grasping, if it's something that is kind of important for our survival, like food that we don't have. But once those basic needs are met, then there's this possibility of connecting, and we are in our training creating as far as possible the conditions for those needs to be met, not just in our physical well-being, as in having food and not being immediately being attacked by an animal, but the threats that tend to come from our own minds. So the imaginations of what might happen in the future, or the rememberings of previous threats which are there to warn us of what might happen in the future. So when we learn how to hold those in a skillful way, in a spacious way, in a non-attached way, we can be more able to access these modes of kindness, which means we're more likely to feel well, which means we're more likely to be able to offer to others as well, because it tends to be when we're less stressed, we're more able to hold what's going on around us and not just within us. So this is not kind of a separate process of my well-being versus your well-being. It doesn't work like that. It's actually recognizing the interconnectedness of the inner and the outer, and how the outer affects the inner and the inner affects the outer. Hence, self-compassion and compassion, like other compassion, actually isn't about self and other. It's really just compassion. And why wouldn't it be directed inwardly and outwardly? Because both actually lead to mutual benefit. Christopher Germer, who is one of the developers of the Mindful Self-Compassion program, which some people may have experience with, talks, I think, helpfully about a kind of a process that we can go through when we train in compassion, which is that we move from the default mode of aversion to difficulty to an acknowledging. It's a bit like aversions at this end, where we start out and we make a little step in our first perhaps weeks or months of training into acknowledging difficulty, actually recognizing and naming what's here. And once we've acknowledged, we can take another step towards allowing, actually being able to tolerate and make space for what's threatening without reacting in a threatened way. And that can lead to greater curiosity, which starts to move us towards the experience. And then finally, we might come into befriending, which is quite a journey from aversion to the difficult to befriending the difficult. By the way, when I say befriending the difficult, it doesn't mean we're kind of inviting all sorts of catastrophes onto us. It means that we are being willing to meet what is here now in order to make skillful choices. So it's an inner kind of befriending of the moment. It's not kind of, as is sometimes described, as kind of passive or stupid. It doesn't mean we don't jump out the road when a car is coming at us. So we can do this through, we can practice this through standard mindfulness meditation practices, which all implicitly cultivate a compassionate stance or approach. And there are specific meditation practices which explicitly can cultivate and bring out these qualities within us. And in a couple of different ways. One, through actually helping us to access the soothing mode within us. So to tap into this quality of the parasympathetic nervous system, finding perhaps a soothing sense of working with the breath, or perhaps using soothing touch to connect with ourselves and to reassure ourselves, like we might reassure an upset child that we're there for them. What are sometimes called the bottom-up approaches, because they work with the kind of lower parts of the brain. And by that I mean, so I don't know if you know the hand model of the brain. So if we've got sort of brainstem here and limbic system here, and then prefrontal cortex that folds over the top. The bottom-up methods are working with the lower parts here, the very basic parts that are about reaction to threat or grasping for the pleasant. The limbic system very much about tending and soothing, because we share this with mammals. And then the prefrontal cortex, which is more highly developed in human beings. So we've got this very sort of simple way of looking at it. The bottom up is soothing, connecting, working at a feeling level. And then the prefrontal cortex folded over, which is sometimes called the top-down ways of cultivating, where we actually use thought and imagery to support the soothing of the kind of the lower parts of the brain. If that makes sense. So we can work in this in two different ways, and then in the practice that I'm going to guide in a moment, we'll kind of have a play with both of these different ways of working. So you might get a sense of what I mean by the kind of bottom up and top down, or the feeling tone based and the thought based or visualization based. All right, so let's experiment with some practice.